What if I told you the greatest threat to American stability isn't a foreign army or a political ideology, but the price of a carton of eggs? What if the bread lines of the 1930s haven't vanished, but have merely changed their location? Have you ever looked at a grocery receipt and felt your stomach drop before you even put the bags in the car? That feeling is not paranoia. It is history repeating itself, a quiet echo of a past that Americans believed was long buried. In 1933, at the height of the Great Depression, desperate families lined up in bread lines that stretched for blocks, clutching tin cups for a single ladle of soup. Their crisis was one of complete economic collapse, a failure of employment that left millions with nothing. Nearly a century later, in the year 2025, the bread line has not disappeared. It has simply moved indoors. It now snakes through the polished aisles of Walmart, Costco, and Kroger. The line is at the checkout, and the rationing happens not with a government issued coupon book, but in the quiet, agonizing decisions made over a shopping cart. Back then, unemployment reached a staggering 25%, and families simply could not find work to afford food. Today, the official unemployment rate sits under 5%, a figure that should signal prosperity. But what good is a paycheck when a gallon of milk costs $6, a loaf of bread is $4, and a dozen eggs sells for $5? The dissonance is jarring. In 1930, a loaf of bread cost a nickel. When adjusted for nearly a century of inflation, that loaf should cost about $1 today. Instead, American families are paying 4 times that amount. The hunger of the 1930s has not vanished. It has merely put on a modern disguise, cloaking itself in the language of economic indicators and quarterly reports. This is not just inflation. It is a silent collapse of affordability, a systemic crisis that is fundamentally rewriting the American social contract. The nation is not on the edge of a historical moment. It is living inside of it. The Great Depression is no longer a sepia-toned chapter in a textbook. It is back, it is in your kitchen, and it is staring you in the face every time you shop for food. The crisis reveals itself most starkly in the aisles every family knows best, beginning with the most basic staple of human sustenance, bread. Once the cheapest, most accessible food in the world, its price tag now tells a story of profound economic distress. As recently as 2022, a consumer could pick up a standard loaf of white bread for around $2.50. Today, in 2025, that same loaf costs $4.20. This represents a surge of nearly double in just 3 years. The critical question every working American must ask is a simple one. Did my paycheck double in that same period? For the overwhelming majority, the answer is a resounding no. And bread is just the beginning of the story. Take milk, the backbone of every breakfast table and a non-negotiable purchase for families with children. Just 2 years ago, a gallon of whole milk cost on average $3.50. In 2025, it is breaking the $6 barrier in many states, with some urban centers seeing prices as high as $6.75. For a family that uses 2 gallons a week, that is an extra $12 to $15 a month spent on a single item. It does not sound catastrophic until you realize that every single item in the cart has followed the exact same punishing trajectory. What about protein, the essential building block for health and development? Eggs, once the undisputed symbol of cheap, accessible nourishment, now tell a brutal story of hyperinflation. In 2022, a dozen large eggs could be purchased for $1.50. Now, a price of $4.60 is common across the country. That is more than a 200% increase Families who rely on multiple cartons a week to feed their children are suddenly forced to ration, a word many Americans thought belonged exclusively to history books about World War II. The nightmare only deepens as one moves to the meat section. Chicken breast, America's go to dinner protein, has climbed from an average of $2.99 a pound to $5.50, almost doubling in price. Ground beef, the foundation of countless family meals, from spaghetti bolognese to hamburgers, has surpassed $7 a pound in many supermarkets. The question writes itself. When the cheapest and most common proteins become luxury items, what happens to the diets of working class families? The answer is as simple as it is tragic. They collapse. Families are forced to pivot away from nutritious whole foods and toward processed meals, cheaper calories, and long term health sacrifices. Even the small comforts, the daily rituals that make life manageable, are no longer safe. Coffee, the morning lifeline for 150 million Americans, has surged from an average of $5 a pound to $8, with premium and organic blends routinely crossing into the double digits. Imagine starting every single day with a potent reminder that even your caffeine is now part of the crisis. This is no longer just about numbers on a receipt, it is about dignity. Grocery shopping used to be a routine chore. Now it is a weekly stress test, a financial gauntlet that millions of Americans dread. It is parents discreetly putting items back at the register, their faces etched with quiet shame. It is seniors on fixed incomes cutting their fresh produce purchases in half. It is college students skipping meals outright to make rent. What once felt ordinary now feels like survival. If you think shopping smarter or hunting for deals will save you, think again. The crisis has become so pervasive that even the cheap giants, the big box stores that families once trusted to stretch a dollar, are now part of the problem. Take Walmart, the behemoth retailer, long advertised as the champion of low prices. Its slogan, "Save money, live better," now rings hollow. In 2023, a 5 pound bag of all purpose flour at Walmart cost $2. Today, that same bag is $3.50, a 75% jump. A 10 pack of frozen chicken breasts, a staple for meal preppers and busy families, once sold for a reliable $10. Now it rings up at $15, a 50% increase on a single item. Multiply that level of inflation across a full cart of 20 or 30 items, and the math becomes devastating. Costco, the warehouse giant, built its entire empire on the promise of bulk savings. Yet in 2025, even buying in bulk is breaking family budgets. A case of 24 canned tomatoes, a cornerstone for countless sauces and stews, sold for $18 just 2 years ago. That same case is now $25. That is $7 more for the same steel cans of tomato paste. Peanut butter, the giant tub that families have long relied on for school lunches and quick snacks, went from $7 to $10. It sounds small, $3 here, $7 there, but these incremental increases are insidious. Across a year of bulk shopping, these small hikes add up to hundreds of extra dollars, draining out of already stretched wallets, effectively nullifying the very concept of bulk savings. Even Whole Foods, the premium grocer, once mockingly nicknamed Whole Paycheck, has transformed into something even worse, a terrifying preview of where mainstream prices are headed. The store is no longer an outlier, it is a bellwether. Organic apples, which averaged $2 a pound in 2023, are now $3.50. Almond milk, a popular dairy alternative, has surged from $3 to $4.50 per carton. A family that swapped dairy for plant based products for health or ethical reasons is now being financially punished for that switch, paying $1.50 more per carton every single week. No chain has been spared. Kroger, Safeway, Publix, every regional and national supermarket tells the same grim story. This is not a localized issue, it is a national plague. Analysts at Nielsen IQ reported that between January 2024 and January 2025, the average American supermarket basket increased in price by 12.8% nationwide. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations echoed the alarm on a global scale, warning that global food prices in 2025 remain 30% above pre-pandemic levels. That is not just a headline for millions of working class budgets, it is a death sentence. So, where do families turn? The heartbreaking answer is nowhere. Whether it is Walmart's everyday low prices, Costco's bulk savings, or Whole Foods premium organic selection, every logo tells the same story. Food costs are rising much faster than paychecks, and the American promise of affordability is dead. The grocery cart has become the new battlefield of American life, and no matter which store you push it through, you are losing money at every aisle. So, why are grocery bills exploding like this? Why does every trip to the store feel like a meticulously planned financial ambush? The answer is not one single thing, but a catastrophic chain reaction of runaway inflation, broken supply lines, worsening climate disasters, and government policies that hit family wallets like hidden taxes. Let's start with the most obvious culprit, inflation. The official reports from the Bureau of Labor Statistics paint a grim picture. Grocery prices rose another 11.2% in 2024, a devastating increase that came on top of an already painful 13% increase in 2023. When you stack those 2 years together, you are looking at nearly 25% inflation on food in just 2 years. Wages, meanwhile, have crawled up by only 4% annually during the same period. This is the math of disaster. It means that for a family earning $50,000 a year, their paychecks might have risen by $2,000, while their annual grocery bills have jumped by as much as $5,000. Families are not just falling behind, they are actively drowning. Now, layer on top of this the impact of former President Trump's new tariffs. Enacted in early 2025, sweeping tariffs on imports from China, Mexico, and Europe were billed as a measure to protect American workers. But at the checkout counter, they feel like a food tax. The price of imported rice jumped 20% overnight. Canned tuna, much of which is processed abroad, surged 25%. Imported cheeses, a staple in many households, spiked by nearly 30%. Even coffee beans, the vast majority of which come from abroad, rose another 15% in just 6 months. A family that once spent $20 a week on a combination of rice, seafood, and coffee is now paying closer to $30. That is $500 more per year, sucked straight out of household budgets by distant tariff wars. And tariffs do not just raise prices on imports, they trigger retaliation. Mexico slapped tariffs on U.S. corn and beef. China taxed American soybeans and wheat. The result is a vicious lose-lose cycle. Farmers at home are squeezed, forced to pay more for fertilizer and feed, while shoppers pay more for the final product. The farm bleeds, and the consumer starves. Then there is the supply chain, a term that sounds boring and technical until you realize it is the invisible rope choking your grocery bill. Remember the pandemic era shortages of 2020? Those logistical wounds never fully healed. Transportation costs are still profoundly inflated, with diesel prices remaining stubbornly high nationwide. Shipping a single truckload of produce from California's Central Valley to New York now costs 30% more than it did in 2022. That cost does not magically disappear. It is stamped directly into the price tag on every tomato, every apple, and every head of lettuce. Climate disasters are piling on top of this fragile system. The United States Department of Agriculture reported that extreme droughts in the Midwest cut corn yields by 15% in 2024, while historic floods in California destroyed entire fields of strawberries and lettuce. On the global stage, wheat prices jumped 18% after poor harvests in war torn Ukraine and drought stricken Argentina. Food is not just scarce in some abstract sense, it is measurably scarcer. And that scarcity writes new, higher dollar signs across grocery shelves every day. And while American families struggle, corporations are thriving. The major food producers and retailers are not losing money in this crisis. Many are reporting record profits. Kroger's 2024 annual report, for instance, showed that the company's net earnings were up 22%, even as its own consumers screamed about inflation. Tyson Foods, a dominant force in the meat industry, quietly raised its prices by an average of 14%, pocketing billions in additional profit. A widely circulated study from the Harvard Business Review gave this phenomenon a name: greedflation, the practice of raising prices well beyond the actual cost increases simply because desperate consumers have no choice but to pay. Put all these forces together: inflation stripping paychecks, tariffs acting as stealth taxes, climate disasters slashing supply, and corporations fattening their margins, and the picture is chilling. The grocery aisle is no longer a simple marketplace. It has become a pressure cooker where global politics, corporate greed, and natural disasters converge. And every beep at the checkout scanner is not just a transaction, it is a reminder that America's cost of living is spiraling out of control, with no off ramp in sight. What happens when the price of survival climbs faster than paychecks? The answer is no longer theoretical. It is painfully visible in kitchens and on dinner tables across America. Families are skipping meals. Parents are quietly eating less so their children can have more. Seniors on fixed incomes are making the impossible choice between groceries and life-saving prescriptions. The hard data backs up these heartbreaking anecdotes. A 2025 report from Feeding America revealed that 1 in 4 U.S. households, 25%, skipped meals at least once a week because they could not afford enough food. Compare that to just 1 in 10 households in 2019. The number has more than doubled in just 6 years. The USDA's latest food security survey reinforces this grim reality, showing that 17 million American households now live with food insecurity, meaning they do not know with any certainty if their next meal will be affordable. That is nearly 50 million people, a population larger than the entire state of California, living on the precipice of hunger in the richest country on earth. But this crisis is not only about hunger, it is about what fills the plate when food is available. When milk is $6, eggs are $5, and chicken is $6 a pound, families do not stop eating entirely. They downgrade. Fresh produce and lean proteins, the cornerstones of a healthy diet, are the first things to be replaced by processed fillers, instant noodles, canned pasta, and dollar menu fast food. A recent Harvard public health study found that 68% of lower income families reported cutting back on fresh fruit and vegetables in 2024, substituting them with cheaper, less nutritious options. The long-term result is tragically predictable: rising rates of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease in communities already struggling to stay afloat. And then there is the immense mental cost. The American Psychological Association reported a 34% increase in anxiety and depression diagnoses linked directly to financial stress over food between 2022 and 2025. Imagine the daily grinding strain of this reality. A mother putting back a bag of apples at checkout because she is $5 over budget. A father working two jobs, yet still unable to afford a full week's worth of groceries. A child who notices, with the quiet perceptiveness of the young, that the fridge is always half empty. These are not isolated anecdotes. They form a nationwide pattern of quiet, mounting desperation. Food banks, once the last resort for the destitute, are now overwhelmed and have become a routine part of life for many working families. In 2025, Feeding America's network of food banks reported distributing over 6 billion meals, a record high. Some distribution centers report lines of cars wrapping around city blocks, with demand up 40% compared to just 2021. What looks like a modern bread line is exactly that, a digital echo of the Great Depression, but with cars waiting in drive-through donation lanes instead of men in worn-out coats queuing with tin cups. And hidden beneath all of this is a mountain of debt. According to the credit reporting agency TransUnion, Americans put $68 billion worth of groceries on their credit cards in 2024, an all-time high. Families are not just buying food, they are financing it. With credit card interest rates averaging over 20%, that $200 grocery bill can balloon into $250 if not paid off immediately. It is a vicious, inescapable cycle. Buy now, owe later, and sink deeper every single week. The cruelest irony of all is that while millions go hungry, the United States wastes nearly 30 to 40% of its entire food supply annually, according to the USDA. Billions of dollars worth of perfectly good food rots in landfills due to supply chain inefficiencies and retailer overstocking. It is a grotesque imbalance. Scarcity at the checkout line and abundance in the dumpsters. The human toll of this crisis cannot be measured in receipts alone. It is measured in skipped dinners, in children eating cereal for supper, and in the silent, pervasive anxiety of households living one bad week away from genuine hunger. The grocery store is no longer just a place to shop. It has become the stage where America's profound inequality plays out in real time, with billions of dollars in corporate profits on one side and empty refrigerators on the other. Faced with a crisis of this magnitude, the nation's political institutions have responded not with decisive action, but with a familiar and paralyzing cocktail of partisan blame shifting and ideological gridlock. In Washington, the halls of Congress echo with fiery speeches that offer little in the way of tangible relief. One side of the aisle points furiously at government spending and environmental regulations as the root causes of inflation, arguing that the only solution is to slash programs and unleash corporations from regulatory burdens. The other side counters by blaming unrestrained corporate greed and decades of wage stagnation, proposing measures like a windfall profits tax on food conglomerates and a federal investigation into price gouging. While they debate, both parties seem to agree on one thing: the other side is entirely to blame. As a result, meaningful legislation has stalled. A bill to temporarily suspend the federal gas tax to lower shipping costs passed the House but died in the Senate. A proposal to dramatically increase funding for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, failed to get enough votes to overcome a filibuster. The political system designed for compromise has proven incapable of addressing a fundamental crisis of survival. This inaction at the federal level has forced communities to fend for themselves, creating a patchwork of local, often desperate solutions. A new wave of grassroots activism has emerged. born not of political ideology, but of sheer necessity. In cities across the country, community gardens are sprouting in vacant lots and on rooftops, tended by neighbors seeking to reclaim some measure of control over their food supply. Urban farming initiatives, once a niche hobby, are now seen as a critical lifeline alongside them. Mutual aid networks have exploded in popularity. These are not charities, but rather neighbor to neighbor support systems where people share resources, directly trading homegrown vegetables for childcare or pooling money to make bulk purchases of essentials like flour and rice. On social media, local bartering groups have thousands of members, coordinating the exchange of goods and services without any money changing hands. It is a resilient, inspiring response, but it is also a damning indictment of a system that has failed its people. These are the survival mechanisms of a society under immense strain, a quiet, decentralized rebellion against a market that no longer serves them. While these efforts provide immediate relief for some, they cannot solve the systemic problems driving the crisis. They are life rafts in a raging storm, not a lighthouse guiding the nation to a safe harbor. The pervasive sense of abandonment is fueling a deep and corrosive public anger, which is beginning to manifest in more organized and potentially volatile ways. Where does this end? That is the question haunting economists, policymakers, and millions of American families staring at shrinking grocery bags and ballooning receipts. If food prices rose 25% in just 2 years, what happens if that same devastating trend continues into 2026? The answer is chilling. It points toward a middle class America that looks less like the world's richest nation and more like a country teetering on the edge of famine. Reports from the USDA already forecast that food at home costs could rise another 7 to 9% in 2025, with staples like dairy and meat once again leading the surge. If these projections hold, by 2026, a gallon of milk could pass the $7 mark. A carton of eggs could hit $6, and a pound of ground beef could settle near $9 per pound. For an average family of four, that translates into weekly grocery bills of $300 or more, which amounts to nearly $15,000 per year. That is an amount that rivals the cost of in state college tuition in many parts of the country, spent on the basic necessity of food alone. But the danger is not only price, it is access. The USDA already designates 19 million Americans as living in food deserts, areas with severely limited access to affordable, nutritious groceries. Analysts warn that this number could climb past 25 million by 2026 as persistent inflation forces more supermarkets in poor and rural neighborhoods to close their doors. When these stores shutter, residents are left to rely on overpriced corner shops and fast food chains, locking entire communities into unhealthy, expensive diets from which there is no easy escape. Debt is another ticking time bomb. In 2024, Americans charged $68 billion in groceries on credit cards. If interest rates remain above 20%, financial analysts predict that figure could exceed $80 billion by the end of 2025, creating a generation of households that are financing food like they finance cars. Picture the absurdity. Groceries bought in January are still being paid off in July with an extra 25% added in interest. That is not just unsustainable. It is a recipe for catastrophic financial ruin for millions. Meanwhile, the tariff wars show no signs of de-escalating. Analysts at Moody's warned that if the Trump administration's 2025 tariff plan continues into 2026, food inflation alone could spike another 12 to 15%. Imagine a scenario where tariffs add another $800 a year to the average family's grocery bill, on top of the $5,000 increase already inflicted by baseline inflation. That is a hidden food tax, larger than what many Americans pay for their entire year's worth of utility bills. Global instability only compounds the risk. Climate scientists warn that continued droughts in the American Midwest and floods in California could slash yields of essential crops like corn, wheat, and lettuce by another 10 to 20% in 2026. The FAO projects that global wheat prices could climb another 15% if geopolitical conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East persist. America does not live in an economic bubble. When global food prices jump, U.S. shoppers bleed at the register. But perhaps the most frightening trend is the migration of hunger into the suburbs. Food insecurity has long been associated with poverty in inner cities and isolated rural towns. But in 2025, new research from Pew shows that 41% of suburban households now report cutting back on groceries due to cost. By 2026, the image of hunger will no longer be isolated to neglected neighborhoods. It will appear in quiet cul-de-sacs, in two-income households that, despite doing everything right, simply cannot keep up. And what happens to a society when a significant portion of its population can no longer afford to eat properly? History gives us grim clues. The social unrest of the 1930s, the food riots of the 1970s. Analysts at the Brookings Institution have warned that if food inflation persists at these levels, widespread civil unrest cannot be ruled out. Already, surveys show 68% of Americans blame government policies for rising costs, while 52% believe corporations are engaging in predatory price gouging. Anger is building, and hunger has always been gasoline on the fire of protest. This is the America we are sleepwalking into, a nation where grocery shopping becomes a luxury, where bread lines return in digital form through overwhelmed food bank apps, and where millions live one empty fridge away from despair. The Great Depression is not just history, it is a warning. And in 2025, that warning is flashing red.